When Nazi forces advanced, the Soviet Union made a decision that seemed like surrender. Entire cities abandoned, factories dismantled overnight, millions left behind under occupation. The secret industrial evacuation, Stalin's scorched earth order, the unexpected consequences at Stalingrad. What happened next changed the entire course of history. Operation Barbarossa. On June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany launched the largest invasion in human history. They called it Operation Barbarossa. Within weeks, the Red Army was overwhelmed. German forces swept across Soviet territory like a tidal wave. Entire divisions were surrounded and captured. Cities fell one after another. In just a few months, the Soviets lost an area bigger than France, Spain, and Italy combined, roughly 600,000 square miles. It was a disaster unlike anything the world had ever seen. Soviet soldiers were outnumbered, outgunned, and caught completely off guard. Millions were taken as prisoners, equipment was abandoned, morale collapsed. Joseph Stalin, the Soviet leader, faced an impossible choice. He could fight to the last man and lose everything, or do something no one expected. He made a decision that would shock his own people and confuse his enemies. It looked like cowardice, but it was actually the beginning of a plan that would eventually turn the tide of the entire war. What did Stalin order his forces to do? Stalin's scorched earth order. Stalin issued a brutal command: destroy everything. If the Soviet army had to retreat, they were ordered to leave nothing behind for the enemy. Burn the crops, blow up the bridges, dismantle the factories, evacuate the people, or leave them. This was called a scorched earth policy. It meant the Germans would march into empty, ruined cities. No food, no fuel, no shelter. The idea was simple but ruthless: deny the invaders everything they needed to survive the Russian winter. Soviet soldiers set fire to their own villages. They destroyed railroads and power plants. Factories were stripped down to the foundation. Livestock was taken or eliminated. Warehouses were emptied or burned. The land itself became a weapon. But this strategy came with a terrible cost. Millions of Soviet civilians were trapped in the chaos. Many couldn't escape in time. They were left behind to face the advancing German army. And what happened to them was far worse than anyone imagined. But why was this decision so controversial? Why it was controversial? Abandonment of civilians. To save the army and the state, Stalin made a choice that haunted the Soviet Union for decades. Millions of civilians were abandoned in occupied territories. Families were separated. Children were left without parents. Entire communities vanished overnight. Those who remained faced unimaginable hardship under Nazi control. The occupiers enforced starvation policies. Food was seized and sent back to Germany. People were forced into labor camps. Villages were burned. Massacres became routine. Historians estimate that millions lost their lives in these occupied zones, not in battle, but through systematic cruelty and neglect. Soviet citizens couldn't understand why their own government left them behind. Was it strategy or betrayal? Stalin's decision created deep wounds that lasted long after the war ended. Survivors questioned whether the retreat was truly necessary. Critics accused Stalin of valuing equipment over human lives. But Stalin defended his decision by pointing to history. He compared the retreat to another famous withdrawal, one that saved Russia over a century earlier. What historical event was he talking about? Propaganda versus reality. Admitting a retreat was nearly impossible for Stalin. Soviet propaganda had always promoted the image of an invincible Red Army. The people were told their military was unstoppable. But now that image was shattered. Cities were falling. Soldiers were retreating. The nation was in panic. Stalin needed a way to explain the disaster without admitting weakness. So he turned to history. He reminded the Soviet people of 1812 when Napoleon invaded Russia. Back then, the Russian army retreated deep into their own territory. They burned their own cities. They stretched Napoleon's supply lines until his army collapsed in the brutal winter. It worked. Napoleon was defeated. Stalin used this story to justify his own retreat. He said the Soviet Union was using the same strategy. It wasn't cowardice, it was cunning. But not everyone believed him. Many saw it as an excuse. Inside the Soviet leadership, there was fear and suspicion, and those who questioned Stalin's decisions paid a terrible price. What happened to the leaders who doubted him? Political purges. Stalin didn't tolerate dissent, especially during a crisis. In Leningrad, which is now called St. Petersburg, local leaders worked desperately to defend their city during the siege. They organized evacuations, they rationed food, they kept the city alive under constant bombardment. But after the war, some of these same leaders were accused of taking too much credit. Stalin believed they were trying to make themselves look like heroes bigger than him. He saw this as a threat. So he had them arrested. Some were executed. Others disappeared into labor camps. Their crime? Allegedly overestimating their own importance in the city's survival. It didn't matter that they had saved lives. Stalin demanded absolute loyalty. Any hint of independent thinking was crushed. This created a culture of fear within the Soviet leadership. No one dared question orders. No one dared take initiative. But while Stalin's political purges silenced his critics, another part of his plan was quietly unfolding in the background, a plan that would save millions. What was this secret operation? The secret industrial evacuation. While the Red Army retreated, Stalin launched one of the most ambitious logistical operations in history. It was done in near total secrecy. Over 1,500 major factories were dismantled piece by piece. Machines, tools, workers, and even entire assembly lines were loaded onto trains. These trains headed east, deep into Soviet territory toward the Urals, Siberia, and Central Asia. The goal was to move the Soviet Union's industrial power out of German reach. If the factories stayed, the Germans would capture them and use Soviet resources to build their own war machine. But if they could be relocated, the Soviet Union could continue producing tanks, planes, and weapons far from the front lines. It was a race against time. Engineers worked day and night. Factory workers became refugees. Millions of people were uprooted and sent to remote regions where winters were harsh and conditions were brutal. Many didn't survive the journey, but those who did became the backbone of the Soviet war effort, and the results were staggering. But how did this massive evacuation actually save the war? Relocation of industry. By 1943, the relocated factories were running at full capacity. The Soviet Union was now producing more tanks and aircraft than Nazi Germany. In fact, they outproduced the Germans in nearly every category of military equipment. This was the turning point. The industrial evacuation meant the Red Army had a steady supply of weapons, even as the Germans struggled with shortages. New T-34 tanks rolled off assembly lines deep in Siberia. Fighter planes were built in the Urals. Ammunition was manufactured thousands of miles from the front lines. The Germans had captured Soviet territory, but they hadn't captured Soviet industry, and that made all the difference. Workers in these relocated factories labored in freezing conditions. Many were women and teenagers, as most men were at the front. They worked 12-hour shifts, sometimes more. Food was scarce, housing was inadequate, but they kept going. Their work saved the Soviet Union. Historians credit this industrial retreat as one of the key reasons the Soviets survived the war. But the factories weren't the only thing evacuated. Millions of civilians were also moved. What happened to them? Civilian evacuations. Despite the chaos and confusion, an estimated 1.7 million people were evacuated from Leningrad alone. Millions more were moved from cities across the Western Soviet Union. These were not soldiers, they were ordinary people. Families, children, elderly citizens. They were loaded onto trains and sent east, just like the factories. Many had no idea where they were going. They left behind their homes, their belongings, their entire lives. The journey was dangerous. Trains were overcrowded. Food ran out. Disease spread quickly. Some trains were targeted by German aircraft. Not everyone made it. But those who survived became the labor force that kept the relocated factories running. They worked in mines, farms, and assembly lines. Without them, the industrial evacuation would have failed. These refugees lived in harsh conditions far from home, but they contributed to the war effort in ways most people never knew. Their sacrifice was invisible, but absolutely essential. And while millions were evacuated, the Red Army itself was also retreating. But this retreat had a hidden purpose. What was it?
Preserving the army. By retreating into the vast Russian interior, the Red Army forced the German Wehrmacht into a type of war they weren't prepared for, a war of attrition. The Germans advanced hundreds of miles, but their supply lines stretched dangerously thin. Fuel ran low, food became scarce, winter arrived, and the Red Army was still fighting. The retreat bought time. It allowed the Soviets to regroup, resupply, and rebuild their forces. By the time the Germans reached Moscow, they were exhausted. The Red Army held the line. Then came Stalingrad. This was the unexpected consequence Stalin's retreat had set in motion. The Battle of Stalingrad became the bloodiest in human history, but it was also the turning point of the entire war. The Germans were defeated. Their advance was stopped. The momentum shifted. From that moment on, the Red Army pushed west all the way to Berlin. The retreat that looked like surrender had become the foundation of victory. Millions of lives were saved because the Soviet Union survived. But this wasn't the first time Russia used retreat as a strategy. History had seen it before. Other historical retreats, lessons from the past. Retreat has been a Russian strategy for over a century. During World War I in 1915, the Imperial Russian Army retreated from Poland and Galicia to avoid being surrounded. It saved the army from destruction, but shattered public morale and contributed to the fall of the Russian monarchy. Then, in 1921, Lenin introduced the new economic policy, known as the NEP. It was called a strategic retreat towards capitalism. After years of war and hardship, the Soviet economy was collapsing. Lenin allowed limited private enterprise to stabilize the situation. It worked. The economy recovered. Even Stalin himself had used retreat before, not in war, but in society. In the 1930s, he reversed radical Bolshevik policies on family and education. He returned to more traditional values to stabilize the birth rate and restore social order. This was called Stalin's Great Social Retreat. All of these retreats had one thing in common: short-term loss for long-term survival. The controversial Soviet retreat of 1941 followed the same pattern. It saved millions, it preserved the nation, and it changed the course of history forever. The Soviet retreat looked like defeat, but it was survival. Factories relocated, civilians evacuated, the army preserved. By 1943, the tide had turned. Sometimes the hardest decision saves the most lives. Strategic retreat became strategic victory. Stalin's controversial choice cost millions, but without it, the cost would have been everything. History's greatest turning points often hide in plain sight. What will you discover next?